Welcome to Your Path to Nonprofit Leadership, the weekly podcast that features the very best in career development in the nonprofit sector. I'm your host, Patton McDowell, and happy to give you actionable ideas to elevate your current or perhaps your future nonprofit organization. Whether you are tuning in for the first time or are a regular listener, thanks for being here. If you want to be a nonprofit leader or maybe more effective in the role you're in now, you're in the right place. I'm glad to bring you these weekly conversations with nonprofit experts who are on the cutting edge of our sector. And if you would, do me a favor, find that share button. Usually it's within the episode graphic on the device you're holding right now. And maybe text or email this episode to one other person so that we can continue to build a global community focused on nonprofit leadership. And folks, this is an episode you will want to share, as I had a fantastic conversation with Andrew Olsen, who brings great experience as the president of Altus Marketing and nearly 25 years of helping nonprofit organizations develop fully integrated fundraising strategies. But not only has he helped many organizations, nearly 1,000, he's also written 2 best-selling books, one called Rainmaking, A Fundraiser's Guide to Landing Big Gifts, and 101 Biggest Mistakes Nonprofit Organizations Make and How to Avoid Them. Well, not surprisingly, his books gave us tons of things to talk about, and you will have many ideas to take back to your organization or to incorporate into your leadership plan. But frankly, one of the fascinating topics we dove into is the concept of toxic leadership. Yes, I'll repeat that, toxic leadership. Does it exist at your nonprofit organization right now? Well, Andrew can help you identify the characteristics of toxic organizations, whether it be on the staff or the board, and more importantly, how you can fix it. Lots of reasons to check out the show notes for this episode. It's number 145. Just go to the podcast or the news page at pattonmcdowell.com, and you'll find all of the resources Andrew and I discuss, in particular, the great work he's doing at Altus, as well as links to his books and the excellent Rainmaker fundraising podcast. You need to check it out, and you'll find links on the show notes so you can do just that. Speaking of resources, while you're on our website, make sure you connect with PMA Nonprofit Leadership. We're on all of the social media platforms. We've got a new YouTube channel so that you can check out if that is the platform through which you like to consume your podcast content. And make sure you get on our email newsletter list. We've got a lot of good things going on right now. And I'm proud to say the release of my new book, also titled Your Path to Nonprofit Leadership, will be out on March 8th, 2022. Without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Andrew Olsen. Andrew, thank you for joining me on the path.
Hey, Patton, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here, man.
Well, I'm excited as well. This is a great conversation. I know that you have a perspective. You're working with nonprofit leaders all over the country. And I know that will bring a perspective that our listeners will benefit from. Of course, you're a fellow podcaster, the great Rainmaker fundraising podcast. So our listeners need to check you out there. And while there are a lot of good things going on in our sector and that you and I both appreciate, there's also some pain points I think a lot of our listeners are feeling, and you have a sense of that. In fact, you used the phrase toxic leadership is something you're seeing. So let's start with that, Andrew. What do you mean by toxic leadership? And why do you think it's become such an issue?
Yeah, well, thanks again for having me, and thanks for inviting this conversation. I actually think it's one of the most important topics in our sector. And it's not a new issue. I'm pretty sure that it's been around since humankind has been around.
Right.
But the way that I think about this and sort of how I got here, when I talk about toxic leadership, what I mean by that is leaders who create or allow environments where people treat one another poorly, right? And where leaders don't deal directly and swiftly when there is some sort of toxic behavior. And that could be anything as simple as someone being made the butt of jokes and poked fun at, to someone being discriminated or harassed, to people just being treated poorly and aggressively by their colleagues. Sometimes it reaches even worse levels when the leader is actually the one behaving in those ways. But oftentimes, we see really damaging impact, not because the leader's that way. In fact, a lot of times these leaders are really great people trying to do good work, but they're reluctant or afraid to deal directly with those toxic behaviors at the staff level, and that just completely damages organizations.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, of course. And do you think it's even more disappointing or a challenge because we expect this sector to be, in essence, a feel-good environment, but in fact, it's not always the case. But do you think that creates an additional challenge that people don't want to rock the boat, even when this kind of behavior exists?
It does, and I think you're right. There's really a couple things going on there. First of all, I do think that there's the mentality that, well, wait a minute, if you work in the social goods sector, if you work in the nonprofit arena, you've chosen that path because you want to do good in the world. So to step into an organization and environment and then realize, wow, this is maybe just as bad, sometimes maybe even worse than what I experienced when I worked in that evil, commercial for-profit world.
Right.
I think there's a sort of a shell shock that happens to some people in that environment. I work a lot with ministry organizations and have for almost 25 years now. We often find that the same or even heightened levels of toxic behaviors happen in ministries. And I think that's another area where people are like, wait a minute, these are supposed to be church people. I thought they were supposed to be perfect and have all this stuff figured out and never behave like this. And the reality is we're all human beings. We're all flawed and no one is immune from bad behavior. But when we take a stand publicly to say we're about this, and part of that this is, we treat people with these certain types of traits, and then we violate that in the way we treat our own staff, or we allow them to be treated, it creates a cognitive dissonance that's really disheartening for a lot of people.
Yeah, I'm glad you're lifting it up, because I hope, if nothing else, you and I, we have listeners now who may feel isolated and alone in this toxic environment in which they operate. And so I'm glad that you're lifting it up, and we're going to talk about in a minute how to deal with it, or perhaps to what extent you can deal with it if you are in such an environment. But let's go back to your journey, Andrew. Obviously, the faith community was one you worked at for 25 years. Is that where you first started seeing these toxic environments, or is it become even more pervasive now in the work you're doing now?
I don't know that it's become more pervasive. I think there is a much greater willingness socially for people to talk about it today than there was even, say, 5 years ago, right? When we think about all of the change that's happened in the last couple of years, whether it's the stresses of the COVID-19 pandemic, the social unrest that we experienced after George Floyd was murdered, any myriad number of other things that have gone on that have really changed the way people think about what is and isn't acceptable behavior. I feel like there's a lot greater willingness, particularly amongst young professionals, to raise their hand and say, hey, this is not okay. Like, it feels like you've been doing this for years here and you think it's acceptable, but this is wrong. So in my mind, I don't know that it's gotten any worse. I think we've just gotten a little bit better at talking about it than in the past. But it's something that I've seen, again, I've been doing this almost 25 years, and I can remember back early on in my career, working with a number of different organizations, seeing this firsthand and thinking to myself, wow, I thought these people would be different. I guess not. It's not to say that nonprofit leaders are all terrible people. That's not the point at all. It just goes back to the fact that we are all flawed, and if we don't, if we're not introspective, if we don't take the time to understand what is causing us to feel the way we are and to behave the way we are, and then to correct that, and as leaders to hold ourselves accountable to holding others accountable, that just creates an opportunity for this stuff to flourish.
Yeah, I love the way you articulate that. And as the parent of 3 young adult kids, I give them credit. I do think that generation is more willing to call it what it is. And my journey, like yours, perhaps I saw things and I didn't speak up. And
sure,
so I hope you and I are both encouraging folks to speak up on that. And I guess, Andrew, does your experience now over those multiple decades, does it talk about how it shapes the work you're doing now?
Yeah, so this is an interesting perspective. When I wrote my second book, 101 Mistakes Nonprofits Make and How You Can Avoid Them, one of the key learnings that drove me to write that, I went and met with about 80 nonprofit organizations. This was back pre-pandemic when you could sit, across a desk from somebody without worrying about anything, and so over about a year and a half period, I met with these organizations, and each one of them had initially said something like, we have a fundraising problem. We have a fundraising challenge. Come help us figure out how to raise more money. And in those conversations, almost every one of them, the observation that I had was, there's no lack of money. There's no lack of critical mission. There's no lack of donor desire. But wow, do you have a lack of leadership? And in many instances, it was toxic behavior in the workplace that was contributing to the organization's inability to actually achieve the revenue that they needed to deliver on mission. So that's what got me in the mindset of writing that book. And dealing with toxic employees is one of the chapters in the book, particularly because of how profoundly negative the impact is on staff morale, on your ability to show up and do good work every day, and ultimately deliver mission.
Such a good point. And I've had similar conversations. They probably want you, Andrew, to give them tactical bandaids, right? In terms of just give us a fundraising tactic and solve our problems. And you're like, no, we've got to pull the Band-Aid here and see the underlying issue.
Exactly.
Well, talk about exactly what you do at Altus Marketing. Again, that's, I know, a culmination of your journey of experience, but I want our listeners to know, what exactly does Altus Marketing do?
Absolutely. So Altus Marketing is what we refer to as a fully integrated direct response fundraising agency. So what that means, at the very tactical level, is we help nonprofit organizations and ministries. So whether you're a food bank or a rescue mission or the Salvation Army or a large organization like the Museum of the Bible, organizations like that, to hone their fundraising message and to take that out into the market to inspire people to give. So, we work in things like digital fundraising, direct response television, radio, direct mail, and we do a lot of consulting and provide services to clients in those areas. We work nationally with large scale nonprofits, but also very locally with small, homeless shelters, food pantries, things like that.
Yeah, I've seen evidence of your work, Andrew. It's fantastic. And of course, I'm going to encourage our listeners to check it out on the show notes. They can link to you and Altus in a variety of ways. And I guess, though, I want to go back to your good point. While you're there and you have the skills and tools to help them with fundraising, how do you address some of the toxic leadership issues? I guess, how do you attack that issue when they say, help us fundraise? And then you're like, wow, we've got to fix the issues of leadership first.
Carefully is the answer. Yeah.
Right.
It's one of those things where none of us ever like to hear that we're the problem, right? We always want to hear either there's an external thing that's causing the problem or somebody else is falling down on the job. And if we just fix that person, everything will get better. When we have to have this conversation, it's usually, a very delicate discussion with leaders about what needs to change organizationally and culturally to get them prepared to actually take advantage of the revenue opportunities that are already on the table. So oftentimes, we can sit and show an organization, hey, you have a donor base of X thousands of supporters and they've given millions of dollars, and maybe they're giving millions of dollars to other people right now. They're not giving to you because of something that's disconnected, right?
Yep.
And then, going through that process to eventually show that, hey, there are cultural indicators that are holding you back. It's not that you aren't doing the right number of solicitations. It's not that you, don't have the right logo on your letterhead or the right number of emails that you're sending.
Right.
One of the biggest places to look at this is your staff turnover, right? If you lose major gift staff every 12 months, there's probably a problem there that has nothing to do with fundraising. Right?
Well, I was going to ask you of what evidence you see, and you mentioned kind of the belittling culture or some of the issues of, even harassment, but turnover, is that kind of one of the key characteristics you're looking at when you go into an organization to see if there indeed might be a leadership issue?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly one of the lagging indicators, right? So we'll be able to look at that and go, oh, okay, so this organization has 12-month turnover on major gift staff. Something's broken there at a leadership level,
Right.
Whether it's board or executive leadership, or could it, depending on what's going on, could even be staff level challenges. But it could be toxicity, it could be other things. But oftentimes we find that the organizations that allow toxic behaviors to become part of the norm, and what I mean by that is not addressing them head on, not understanding and creating a culture where we're both candid but kind.
Right.
Like I tell people, it's
good
okay
way to put it.
It's okay to have a vigorous argument, right? My team, my senior leadership team, this past Friday had a 40-minute, pretty assertive conversation with one another about a particular topic, and I stopped at the end and I said, look, I know this might have been a little painful for everybody, but I actually wish we had recorded this because I think our entire staff needs to see open, healthy debate like this where we can challenge the issues without attacking the people.
Yeah.
And I think oftentimes that's where organizations miss the mark. That and where leaders, where I've seen leaders fall down is you have someone on staff who's incredibly toxic, but maybe they're a high performer. And so you don't deal with them directly or swiftly because either they bring in a lot of revenue or they have an expertise that you don't have, or there's something about them being on staff that you feel is more valuable than the emotional damage they do to the rest of the staff. And that's one of the big ones that I see.
That's such a good example. And I love your term, the assertive discussion. That was a polite way of saying you guys had a good debate, a good argument even. And,
yep.
But don't you agree that many organizations, I think, just are so determined to have a kind of happy, feel-good atmosphere in the staff meetings? But Andrew, they're going to go out and complain about it in the hallway, aren't they? And so
that's exactly right. It's ironic because you see it in nonprofit branding as well, right? We often want to brand how we want the organization to be perceived. We want to be the happy, positive, upbeat, successful organization. But if you look inside, you go, wow, this organization doesn't exemplify anything that's in that brand platform because of the way people behave. And so it does create a pretty strong disconnect. And what's really interesting, what we tell our clients is you can't deliver on a brand promise externally until you deliver on it internally. So for all the work that we do to try and show donors and the general public how positive of an organization we are, if we treat each other like crap, that's going to get out. And the way that we treat one another inside is going to be the way that people outside eventually experience us.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And so how do we deal with that high performing talent who basically drives everybody crazy? And I guess, do you, in a neutral sense as an outsider, I guess, create a safe environment to call this person out, or do you have advice? Because I have been through that as well, and we'll talk, of course, about a similar environment. What do you do with the board member who's your biggest donor, but he's also a jerk in creating an environment for you? But let's start with the staff side. And anything there, Andrew, that you've seen work, or how to create maybe a bridge to a better environment?
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you how I see it dealt with most frequently. And this is not the way that I recommend dealing with it, but oftentimes what happens is we say, oh, Jim's a real jerk. He's rude, he's dismissive, he sent, Patty home in tears. But he just closed us, $300,000 gift.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So let's just move Jim to a different department, or let's give him a different boss, or, any number of things like that. And I tell people often, that's like a doctor saying to you, well, we've found cancer in your lung. We're not going to remove it. We're just going to move it to your lymph nodes and hopefully it'll get better.
Yeah, right.
Like any patient in their right mind would run screaming from that physician. right? But that's exactly how organizations behave on a regular basis. And I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't give people grace and give them opportunity to change, but if we're not dealing with it directly, we're just lying to ourselves. So I think the solution is we have to be willing to have those really hard conversations that are super uncomfortable, and not necessarily publicly, but to pull that person aside and to be able to say, this behavior is not appropriate. Here's what I observed. Here's why it doesn't align with our culture. And here's what I need to see moving forward in order for us to be okay moving forward together.
Yeah, love how you frame that. And I'm guessing, like, I have had this sometimes awkward interaction, but if the person in question is the boss, the executive director, the CEO, I'm guessing you face that too. And would you take the same tact? You've just simply got to say, hey, if you want this organization and its mission to thrive, you've got to kind of hold up the mirror.
Yeah, that's a infinitely more difficult conversation because of the power dynamic there and the very real opportunity for someone's career to be damaged if they shine a light on that, right?
Right.
And that is where the board's involvement and accountability in overseeing an organization and in managing the one employee that they should be managing is really critical. I think one of the hallmarks of the risk on that is the organization where the executive leader says, no one gets access to the board but me. That says a lot to me about that person's willingness to have transparent conversations.
The red flag, right? I mean, it's a danger sign.
In fact, it's one of those warning signs that would probably make me seek employment elsewhere if I were interviewing with an organization where the CEO said that. Because the only people in an organization that can really hold a CEO accountable are going to be the board. And so if they're not, I'm not an advocate of boards managing day-to-day operations in an organization. It's highly inefficient and ineffective. But they have to be plugged in enough to the culture side and to managing the relationship with that executive to understand, the positives and the negatives, the good side and the flaws, and be willing to step in and have those difficult conversations on behalf of the staff when they're necessary.
Yeah, so well put. And I guess underlying two things. One, if I'm interviewing for opportunities, that's a great question to ask, or at least try to figure out, right? Is there access to the board? Particularly if I'm the senior fundraiser and this ED doesn't want any access of other senior leaders to the board, you're right, red flag there. And I wonder too, if there is an actual evaluation process. I've seen, Andrew, a lot of nonprofits, and not because the executive director is unwilling, but I think the board, and I guess that's what you're saying, are they abdicating their responsibility by not conducting an actual evaluation of the ED?
Yeah, you're exactly right. I think, I've sat on a couple of boards, I've chaired a handful of boards, and what is interesting to me is very few organizations have a strategic recruitment and onboarding process for their boards. So I've been on boards where I came in and had no idea what was expected of me.
Great point.
What the process was for evaluation, how to know whether I was successful as a board member and whether the CEO was successful as the leader of the organization. So, and that's, that's not because people are, I think, intentionally doing something poorly. I think it's an area that's just cloudy for a lot of people.
Right. Right.
A lot of nonprofit leaders have never worked in an organization that maybe had a really healthy, strategic board and organization sort of charter to understand how that relationship flows both ways, what the expectations are. There's, a lot of organizations can't afford things like formal board training and things of that nature. So I think that we fall down in those areas because we've not resourced board members well. We've not resourced executive directors and CEOs well around that. And there's nobody holding us collectively accountable for doing it better.
Yeah, I love how you're getting beyond the symptoms that are exhibited in an organization, but getting at the root cause here, right? If the board member had never received an orientation, and frankly, I see a lot of boards that have no, in essence, job description. So they're going to, despite their good intentions, who knows what they're going to do? And then you're seeing that obviously then will affect the executive director and ultimately the staff if there's that disconnect throughout the whole environment.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the board angle in particular. You've, I know, seen both the toxicity on the staff side, and I'm wondering if you've seen maybe the equivalent. And to me, the best example is that board member that is obnoxious, but is in fact your biggest donor. Or have you seen variations of that, Andrew, where the toxic environment is a board issue?
I have. In fact, I've told some colleagues a story from early in my career when I was in a similar role that I am now at another organization where I was, providing services to nonprofits. And I walked into a board meeting, having been invited there by the board chair and the CEO. They had a great close relationship and were very well aligned in their vision for the organization. And so I showed up in Ohio for this meeting and sit down and we're having a conversation with the board. And about 15 minutes in, 3 other board members march into the room late to the meeting and throw down their respective materials at each of their seats and immediately started taking the CEO to task and just really negative comments, just berating him, belittling him, talking about all sorts of things that they thought that he wasn't doing well. And it was so bad that I ultimately just folded up my notebook and left the room and said,
"Ouch,
this is not appropriate for me to be here."
Right.
And the board chair followed me out of the room, outside in the parking lot, and said, "Well, wait, we were waiting to hear how you could help us." And I had to kind of laugh and say to him, like, "You guys aren't aligned on anything. I don't think I can help you at all." And what came to light in that follow-up conversation was that this particular board member had been on the board for like 15 years and was such a strong personality that anytime he didn't agree with something, he threw a tantrum like this, and it changed the trajectory of the entire organization because of it. And so that was a really really crystallizing learning for me early on. And I my first thought after the dust settled was, he's been on this board for 15 years. Like, if nothing else, this is the primary argument for term limits.
Exactly. Speaking of red flags, right?
Yeah, and for a clause in your board bylaws to be able to remove a board member with majority vote, this organization had neither of those, so they were essentially held hostage by this guy who just ran around the community treating people poorly. That's one example. I've definitely seen and heard others. I spoke with a woman recently who was a development director who, in the last couple of years had a really negative experience where a board member who was one of their most significant donors had accosted her and harassed her.
Wow.
And she was struggling to figure out how to deal with that because she didn't want to be the person to chase away their biggest 6-figure donor, right? So, those are the kind of things that organizations and fundraisers and executive directors are dealing with. I don't know how regularly, but certainly regularly enough that you and I can talk through multiple examples in this call, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So I think that's another one of those areas where you really have to have a very transparent culture at the board level. And there needs to be checks and balances across the organization, up and down, so that if ever someone feels like they're being treated inappropriately, there's a mechanism for them to address that with the organization and with someone who can help safely have that conversation.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt you, Andrew, because that's so well put. You illustrate so well, sadly, what the toxic environment looks like, but maybe I'm anticipating what you're about to say, which is the best way to offset that, I guess, is you're saying at the orientation level for the board, and I guess a willingness and a frequency around conversations that let's call out both good and bad behavior? Or have you seen other kind of illustrations of ways to kind of create a better culture?
No, yeah, I think you're right. It starts with setting the expectation and saying to people, look, if you're going to be part of this organization, whether you're on staff, you're an executive, or you're a volunteer board member, these are the behavior expectations that we have. And these are the ways that we hold one another accountable for behaving appropriately. And also, this is the conversation we're going to have if you violate that. So I think that clarity up front is really important. I do think that it's critical in organizations and also for boards to have mandatory training on things like discrimination and harassment and what's appropriate in the workplace. Oftentimes that's pushed down to a staff level because the assumption is, well, gosh, if a staff member has an experience like this, we could get sued. So for insurance purposes, we need to protect ourselves and send people through this harassment training. But if you don't also enforce that at the board level, particularly because there's an increasingly skewed power dynamic between boards and the employees in organizations, you run some big risks there as well. And then I think, we have to, as leaders, be strong enough to stand up to that and to, when someone makes an off-color joke, for someone in the room to say, hey, that's not appropriate.
Not appropriate.
When someone berates another employee or another person on the board, to pull that person aside and say, not okay. I understand why you did it. I understand you're frustrated. This is not how we have these conversations.
So well put, Andrew. And it gets back to, I guess, what we talked about on the staff side, that there's an expectation, particularly for a newcomer to nonprofit, that you shouldn't have these kind of problems. And of course we do in any human interaction. But I would think too, there's a similarity for a board member as a volunteer coming in new, not knowing better, that we've got to create an environment that we don't sweep those kind of things under the rug.
Absolutely. And I think we have to be even more careful when it's on the board side, when it comes to board members who are donors, and recognizing that, for example, if you have a donor and you've met with them and or her, and anyone in the room says, yeah, they're really passionate about the cause, they give big gifts, but gosh, they're just a pain to deal with.
Yeah,
like that should be a huge red flag. And nowhere in your engagement plan should the idea be to bring that person onto the board until those behaviors are fully known and addressed, right? Because
yes,
it might be strategically sound to invite that person onto the board to advance a big gift, but it could be destructive to your organization to do that without regard for how it's actually going to impact the people that serve you every day.
Yeah, and I get it. There's a short-term pressure on every nonprofit leader to make budget, right, and to do what they have to do to raise funds. But you're right. You could win the battle but lose the war in a hurry in that kind of strategy. I guess, Andrew, do you suggest approaching these individuals who are donors and either current or potential board members? You almost have to be explicit and say, hey, I want us to have a relationship, and you deserve it as a donor. But as a board member, we're going to talk about you with your board member hat on, or some distinction. Because I'm guessing those individuals, of course, could blur the lines, say, well, I'm on the board because I'm a big donor, therefore y'all need to listen to what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think, again, that goes back to really sort of expectation setting on the front end and really focusing on cultural alignment. So again, understanding that there are those short-term pressures financially. I tend to hew towards the idea that even with a donor, to be able to have a conversation with them about the culture of your organization and how they as a donor integrate into the organization, and that your goal is not that they change your organization through their giving, but that they help change the lives of those you serve, right? So
right.
They're facilitating an end outcome for those that you serve, but you need to be able to maintain the cultural integrity that you've built. And if if you're having that conversation and if there's clarity for the donor in that, then you should be able to have a very similar conversation about just how much more important it is when that donor ultimately ends up having fiduciary responsibility for the organization.
So well put. And I think there's a sigh of relief for many of our listeners who feel the fundraising pressure, but you're kind of giving them the reassurance that, no, it's okay to deal with some of these cultural issues first, right? And not jump to fundraising tactics.
It absolutely is. I mean, I think there are still a lot of organizations that are going to struggle with that because they, someone will say, well, we can't make payroll without that gift.
Yeah, right.
And that's, in some cases that might be true, but allowing your people to be abused and taken advantage of, whether it's a board member or an employee or a donor, there's, in my mind, no reason. Let's say that your organization exists to care for people who are hungry in your community. That's good, good, important, valuable, noble work.
Yep.
If you allow your staff to be abused in the process of doing that work, that devalues the impact of the work that you're doing tremendously. And if addressing that means that you can help fewer people today, but you'll become a healthier organization for tomorrow, I would bet every dollar on that decision.
Extremely on target. And you're right. You may feed a few more now, but ultimately you're going to feed fewer. Your mission will be defeated if you allow that kind of culture to exist, right? And that's exactly what you're reminding us. Well, that seems like a good place to segue. One, I like the arc of this conversation, Andrew, that we started with kind of that foundation, if you will, of culture and how to avoid toxicity. And now we can talk about another area of expertise of yours, which is, in fact, fundraising. You've written 2 books about it, not to say only about fundraising, but maybe we can start with rainmaking.
Sure.
I believe that was your first effort into the author world, and talk about why you wrote it and maybe some of the headlines that would help our listeners, of course, encouraged to get the book as well.
Yeah, it was my first mistake at deciding to try to be an author is what that was.
That makes me want to hear even more now.
So here's how that book came about. My co-author on that book, who's also the co-host of the Rainmaker fundraising podcast, a gentleman named Roy Jones. Roy is one of my best friends. He's a fundraiser in Florida, has had a 30-year career in this industry and raised boatloads of money for all sorts of organizations. He and I were together in Washington, D.C. Patton, as I think I was telling you before we started recording this morning.
Right.
He and I were in D.C. at a conference. We were actually sitting at a table in the Hilton D.C. hotel bar, and we heard a group of fundraisers behind us just all complaining. And these are organizations that we had actually done a study of the data at most of their organizations. So we understood at a really nuanced level who their donors were, what their capacity was, where else they were giving, all the kind of things that you need to understand to know whether or not you can build a healthy fundraising operation. And these fundraisers were complaining about how their bosses had no idea how hard it was to raise money, and they
Right.
didn't know where they would go find major donors. So Roy and I got out a couple of cocktail napkins as we're listening to these people, and we're sitting there thinking to ourselves, the donors are already in your database. Just go talk to them, right?
Yes.
So the premise of rainmaking is really, how should organizations think about taking donors from mass fundraising programs like direct mail, special events, online giving, things like that, and use a different set of tools and tactics to build relationships that ultimately will lead, if done right, to transformational giving from the right donors. So it's really a how-to on building that framework so that you can go from sort of the hamster wheel of just relying on transactional fundraising to starting to engage in relationship fundraising and building transformational giving.
Yeah, that's so well put. And I bet a lot of our listeners are thinking, number one, I wonder if my fundraiser, I'm an executive director. I wonder if my fundraiser is talking about me that way. And so I need to listen and learn, because I think you're right. I think a lot of the executive directors, and in their defense, maybe they didn't come up through the fundraising ranks. They came up through the programming or finance or another area into senior leadership. But is that your advice for them as well, Andrew, that the executive directors need to understand this relationship game? And because I find a lot of them are nervous about fundraising, to be honest. And I wonder, I'm sure Rainmaking might help the executive director just as it would the development director.
It does. In fact, one of the learnings that I had about writing books is, unless you show up, as my wife says, unless you show up on Oprah's bestseller list, well, first of all, she said she's not going to read my books unless they show up on Oprah.
Ouch. But yeah, so my wife said the same. Yeah.
That keeps my ego in check. But unless you write a book that shows up on Oprah's bestseller list, you're probably not going to get rich as an author, right? What Roy and I have done over the years, we've sold some copies of the book, but we've given away probably close to 3,000 copies now to CEOs, board members, fundraisers, volunteer coordinators, anybody and everybody, you name it.
Good for you.
And we've heard CEOs in particular say, I had no idea this is how it was supposed to work, but we've implemented this now and we're raising so much more because of it. So in my mind, that's a win. I think absolutely executive directors and CEOs can find value in this. I also want to plug my friends over at Dickerson Baker and Associates. They did a study in 2021 on the fundraising landscape. And one of the things that they found is that really highly correlated with fundraising success in an organization is the CEO's role in the fundraising process. And it also highly correlated to engagement of the senior fundraiser. So when the CEO or whoever the senior executive is more invested in the fundraising process, it understands it better and values it, the likelihood that your senior fundraiser stays on staff longer and that you raise significantly more money is extremely higher than if the CEO does not value and does not engage in the fundraising process.
Such a good point. And I want to lift up that study because you're right. I think I have read it previously or read parts of it, but it's a great reminder. Andrew, I'm part of a program based here in Charlotte called Leadership Gift School. And the premise of this training program is exactly what you described. It's the teamwork, right, of the executive and the chief development officer that often is lacking. And so we've kind of tried to build a training curriculum around that exact point because, and it sounds like Dickerson Baker confirms, those organizations that have that team dynamic in place are going to be more effective.
Yeah, that's exactly what their study found. I mean, if we think about it logically, right? So imagine you're a senior fundraiser, and I've actually sat in on meetings where this happened, and I've had chief development officers in tears after the fact. Imagine you're sitting there, and your CEO says, "Yeah, I don't do fundraising. That's why I hired those people."
Ouch.
Right?
Yep.
Immediately, what that says to me is, my work here doesn't matter and isn't valued. So why would I try hard? Right? And I think, I think often it stems from a fear because a lot of leaders, like you said, they've come up on the program side or finance or something. They've never done this. It feels icky to them to think that they're going to go beg somebody for money, when in reality, the best fundraisers invite people to make an investment toward an impact. Right.
Yep.
It's not used car sales. It's not begging when done right. There are certainly some cases where it might feel like begging and that's done wrong. But in a high performing organization, that's not how you approach it. And until CEOs really have a deep understanding of that and can gain that understanding in a way that's not threatening to them and their egos, we're going to still have this challenge.
Well put, Andrew. And while it may not have made Oprah's list, it clearly added a lot of value across our sector. And so we got people reading that one. All right, so let's talk about the other one, 101 Mistakes. Why'd you write that? And how would that help our listeners maybe
so
ponder
101
things?
Mistakes is, again, I wrote that after doing about 80 meetings with nonprofits. And what struck me was how many organizations I met with who expressed the same challenges and had essentially made the same mistake, organization to organization to organization to organization.
Yep.
And so I thought to myself, well, wait a minute. In the corporate sector, I have access to all sorts of data that leads me to make conclusions that, hey, I shouldn't do this because other people have tried it and it failed miserably. So why would I make that mistake right now, right? We didn't have something like that in our sector. So I pulled together about 25 colleagues from across the spectrum. I nonprofit CEOs and development officers, finance people, digital marketers, fundraisers, talent development experts, HR experts, and set the framework for writing this book to provide a resource that basically my goal was, we can't keep people from making mistakes. And if we tried to do that, we would stifle innovation. But we can keep them from making mistakes that have already been proven bad, right?
Right.
So the goal was put together this, this manual, if you will, of all, 101 plus examples of really big mistakes that have been made in our sector before that I've made a bunch of myself.
Yes.
So that people entering the sector and those already in it can have a resource to say, oh gosh, we were just thinking of doing this and now I see it here on paper, we should skip that, right? Or to be able to hold up in a meeting and say, look, for example, there's a chapter on toxic behavior.
Yes.
So that hopefully a young fundraiser can walk into her or his, boss's office and say, I want to show you this chapter here because I feel like this is what I'm experiencing and we need to talk about it. If this book accomplishes nothing but facilitating some conversations like that, I'll feel like it's fulfilled its purpose.
That's fantastic. And indeed, it is a resource that people need to check out for exactly that reason and many more. And it leads to kind of my final question, Andrew, because you've given a ton of great advice in this conversation for folks that you and I both talk to who are pondering the nonprofit sector, getting into it, or ultimately aspiring to leadership. Is there other advice you might add? In fact, I would just say what you just described the book, learning about the realities of our sector might be one piece, but is there anything else you tell people who come to you saying, hey, I'm thinking about jumping in?
Yeah, a couple thoughts on that. I think, my first question is what's your motivation, right? If you are, I hear people occasionally say things like, well, I'm a great marketer, but I don't want to work as hard as I do today. So I'm going to go work in a nonprofit. Now, I'm sorry, I've worked in a nonprofit and I've consulted with almost 1,000 of them. This is some of the hardest work ever.
Right. Could not agree more.
So if your assumption is that you're going to come into this sector so that you can kind of relax and coast and be an expert, good luck with that. It's not probably going to work out the way you wanted it. I think people need to have a really honest understanding of the impact they want to make and be really judicious in deciding where they end up to make that impact. And what I mean by that is, oftentimes if someone says, I'm really passionate about helping animals, let's say, and they want to go work for the local cat and dog shelter in their community.
Right.
If they have this desire to make a world-changing impact, yet they go to an organization that is dramatically under-resourced and undercapitalized, it's going to be very hard for them to feel like they're making that sort of impact that they desire. So I'm not saying don't go to work there. I'm just saying temper your goals with your reality.
Well put. Keep your eyes open, right? Eyes wide
absolutely.
open as you enter this sector. And despite the good intentions that we both see, you're right.
Yep.
People need to be careful that could become a disappointment in a hurry.
But on the other side of that, like some of the most meaningful work I've ever done is in this sector. And so if you're looking for a way to make an impact and to create more generosity and more hope in this world, this is a lot better place to do it than selling beer and chips.
Yes. No offense to our beer and chip friends, right? But yes, this is where the action, and I'm glad and I knew you would, that while you have been a wonderful cautionary tale in many respects in this conversation, you absolutely have been a wonderful champion for the nonprofit sector. And for that, I'm grateful that you've shared it with our listeners.
Yeah, Patton, there's one more thing that I would say is if you enter this sector, the smartest thing you can do is go find a mentor who's outside your organization, who's been in the sector longer, who's willing to invest in you as a human being, because there's going to be a time when you say, why the heck did I get into this? I can't do this anymore. And you're going to need someone who's outside your leadership chain to be able to say, hey, let's step back and think about this together and figure out, is it really time for you to go? Or do you just need a little bit of a break and a perspective shift? Because this is hard work and you're going to need that sounding board.
It's great advice. Strategic networking. And you're right. A safe mentor conversationist is a huge asset. And thank you for adding that to already a great list of advice here. Of course, Andrew, we're going to lift up 2 wonderful books that you yourself have produced. But as you know, I ask every guest has there been a book that's been particularly meaningful to you, in addition to yours, that you would recommend to our listeners?
Absolutely. So one of the most important books, in fact, it's on my bookshelf behind me. I'm pretty sure, Patton, it's on yours as well.
Yes.
Is the book Crucial Conversations. And why that's so important to me is that book has an incredibly effective framework for helping people have healthy conversations when the emotional stakes are really high. So whether it's in a family relationship or a romantic relationship or a business negotiation or an employee-employer or a coworker relationship, if you want to be able to navigate hard conversations really well, to get to positive outcomes without damaging relationships, it's the best investment you'll ever make.
Love it. Delighted to lift that up because I am a enthusiastic fan of that book as well. So thank you, Andrew, for lifting it up, and we'll make sure we'll include it with all of the great information and resources you've talked about and provided during this conversation. Where can people find out more about you and the great work you're doing at Altus Marketing?
Thank you for asking. As I've already said, it is not on Oprah's best-selling list, but you can get me on LinkedIn. That's probably the easiest place for people to find me. I'm there fairly regularly. You can also visit Altus Marketing's website. It's altusmktg.com, or you can email me directly. It's aolsen@altusmktg.com.
Wonderful. We will include all of that in the show notes. Check it out. A lot more that you can learn from Andrew and all of his various resources. And Andrew, thank you again for joining me on the path.
Thanks for inviting me. I appreciate the time with you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Andrew as much as I did and came away with some practical ideas that can guide your professional journey and maybe help your organization be more effective, especially if it is dealing with elements of toxic leadership. Don't forget about the show notes. They are available on our website. This is episode number 145. Just go to pattonmcdowell.com and you can find out more about Andrew, Altus Marketing, both of his great books, as well as his fantastic Rainmaker fundraising podcast. As always, please share this episode with someone else on the path. And if you haven't already, you can subscribe to our podcast. Just go to the podcast page at pattonmcdowell.com and you'll see the follow button. That's what it's called now. To subscribe, hit the follow button and you'll get linked to all of the primary podcast platforms. Don't miss out on any of our weekly episodes. They come out every Thursday. And if you like this episode, click on the episodes button on the top of that same podcast web page. And you can scroll through thumbnails of each and every one of these fantastic conversations, now numbering 145. Thanks for all you're doing in the nonprofit sector, especially right now. And keep up the good work for causes that are most meaningful to you. I'll keep bringing you content that can help you do it even better. Have a great week, and I'll see you next time on The Path.